Next up, we have our decentralized identity panel moderated by Jason Ward, VP of Blockchain Product Management in FCAT, featuring Karyl Fowler, co-founder and CEO of Transmute, Dan Buchner, Program Manager of Decentralized Identity Initiatives at Microsoft, and Moiz Kohari, CEO of Manetu. Pass it to you, Jason.
Thanks, Ria. Good afternoon, everybody. Really happy to be here with you today, and I'm really pleased to share that we have an excellent panel. Ria just mentioned the folks on the panel, but I think at this point in time, it's really critical for folks to really start to better understand what digital identity is and how we can take better control over it. So I think it's great positioning coming up after Jameson's talk. So with that, please join me in welcoming Karyl Fowler from Transmute, Daniel Buchner from Microsoft, and Moiz Kohari from Manitou. So what I'd like to do is maybe just start out by asking each of you to just do a brief introduction. And Karyl, maybe we can start with you. Your background prior to joining and founding Transmute was in the life sciences space. So how did that experience bring you into the digital identity space?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jason, and great question. So my background spanned the semiconductor and biotech sectors, and in particular, what Transmute focuses on today is applying decentralized identity technology in the supply chain sector. Most specifically, we're working on identifying and verifying certain kinds of critical trade data. In both life sciences as well as the semiconductor industry, these are highly regulated spaces with deeply complex supply chains. And you run into kind of two major situations, not least of which is that there's lots of disparate parties managing the build of a single product. So generally no one biotech product is manufactured at a single site. So you have to manage the kind of the shifting of that product's build through that supply chain. And then on the semiconductor front, we have a situation where there's more necessary opacity in the supply chain. And in particular, here in the United States, we have offshored a lot of the commodity structures in that space. And so you have kind of us acknowledging here in the United States that we are going to continue to operate these supply chains with some of the foundational layers built in less than trusted countries or less than trusted trading partners. And so that experience kind of put me near and dear to the pain that Transmute solves for today, which is helping span and bridge some of those opaque areas in the supply chain, but without giving away some of that secret sauce or IP or different kinds of trade data that you don't want to share.
That's great, thank you. So seeking to help increase the trust and the confidence and the veracity of the data and the materials. That's great, thank you. Maybe Daniel, we could go to you next. You've been at Microsoft working on the Identity Overlay Network, and it's gotten a lot of information published recently. You guys brought the beta to the Bitcoin mainnet. I was wondering what, if any, particular catalyst sparked your interest in the identity space?
Yeah, so I started sort of on this journey at Mozilla around 2011. Shortly after learning that Bitcoin coming out, the idea that you could have a PKI network for identifiers that wasn't centralized, something that isn't an email address that is the property of a company or phone number that's the property of the telcos, really unlocks a lot. Right? If you really think about why we can't do some things with identity today, some privacy preserving things, it's because the root of all trust really still relies on these intermediaries. So that's kind of where it started. And in 2015, 2016, I went to Microsoft and started the group there that works on decentralized identity. And yeah, I think we made a lot of progress. And I think that this year and the next 12 months especially are going to be transformative. And you'll see a lot of this stuff being brought to bear in real scenarios with companies that are taking things to production to really benefit users and themselves through a technology that advances us and privacy for individuals.
Great, thank you. Moiz, your career journey has taken you through leadership positions at several well-known corporations. What actually triggered your movement to start Manitou and focus on digital identity?
So I was very blessed to lead technology globally for both State Street and London Stock Exchange. One of the problems or one of the challenges that we were running into was some of the data privacy regulations that were coming down that actually force enterprises to provide for certain types of privacy functionality to the consumers, such as what information an enterprise holds on a particular identity, what type of, how do you edit that information, and how do you revoke that information. That's really what Manitou does, is we provide for the ability for enterprises to be able to manage that in a fully automated fashion. Now, when you think about decentralized identity or any type of identity management, I find it very interesting because Manitou does provide for identity verification and identity proofing capabilities. But even the DID spec itself, right, still talks about service endpoint that still has to provide for the ability to identify a particular subject. So at the end of the day, right, whether that service endpoint ends up being a decentralized blockchain, if you will, or it ends up being an IDP service, an identity provider of some sort, the functionality is still the same. So the way we view that is really the DID component of it acts as one particular multi-factor authentication component. So you may leverage that particular certificate to create a token along with multiple other components to create as strong an identity as you can and want, including things like post-quantum cryptography and post-quantum key distribution capabilities. So that's the long-winded answer to your question.
That's great, Moiz. Thank you. I have to say, my own personal journey in identity began about a year ago as our blockchain incubator started to do more research in the space. And we've definitely, as a large institution, have a lot of controls in place around identity authentication, authorization, et cetera. But what I've really come to appreciate personally is that the digital identity is really a double-edged sword. And as so many users are dependent upon centralized gatekeepers to have control over how they can access their data, it also exposes them to potentially the strengths and weaknesses of those gatekeepers. So maybe a question for everyone, and Moiz, we can start with you, is how can digital identity begin to shift the power dynamic from those centralized gatekeepers back to some of the users?
Yeah, so let's think about what we're talking about, okay? An identity on the net really gives you the ability to identify an endpoint and for that endpoint to get service. Obviously, we're not going to the extremes of the last talk where, you're trying to actually disappear, if you will. So I want to receive service on the internet. And how do I make sure that they can identify me? So in my humble opinion, I would suggest that all the things you can do to combine for a strong identity, including DID services that you may leverage, still end up taking you to some type of an authenticator, okay? Whatever that is, whether you want to trust one entity, whatever, large entity, Microsoft, Google, or a small entity, it doesn't really matter, or a decentralized place. You're still getting authenticated prior to receiving service. In our opinion, that authentication of how I really recognize you as a person that I'm providing that service to becomes more interesting if I can do multi-factor on top of that. So I would like to include other factors into that equation. Once I've done that, I can issue you a token, and that token then allows you to get that session for whatever service you're looking for. So what Manitou is really providing for is the ability to provide very strong identity authorization services, and then giving the control of your data attributes that you want to share with a particular entity or all entities which are part of your profile. It gives you the ability to share that data with them on demand and be able to revoke that data. This is not a concept that we created. These are things that GDPR, the Data Privacy Regulation in the European Union, or CCPA, the California Consumer Protection Act, actually obligates companies to do. So we are actually making it so that that obligation becomes somewhat natural.
Great, thank you. And maybe Daniel, sort of following up that same question, with ION, you have the ability to issue credentials, and those credentials can be shared with others and cryptographically verified. So, from your take, how can these DIDs and credentials together actually help put more control back into the user's hands?
Yeah, so I'll illustrate this with some examples that hopefully land home for some normal folks who may not be in the identity technology industry all the time. We talk about ownership of identifiers, right? We just saw a massive social service have an attack whereby, because your identifiers are not your own and there's no signed veracity over what you put out there in the world in relation to them, people were able to socially engineer the ability to send out messages to hundreds of millions of people to try to get them to do things that were not messages that originated from these identifiers. And that's primarily because you do not own your identifiers on those social platforms. They do. So if you can't sign essentially your messages that are outbound, anyone can pretend to be you who happens to be an employee of that service. That also plays a role in many other application service scenarios where not having your ID subjects you to all sorts of negatives, like being deplatformed, the idea that you can just be disappeared. Now, we don't have to side with people politically or socially in all sorts of ways. We can disagree, but the idea that they could be wiped from the face of the earth, in the digital earth anyway, is something that I personally, I hope to end. I hope that we can put a stop to that. Now, what ION does is, it gives you the ability to have identifiers like that. And there's many, instantiations of decentralized identifier technology, like Transmute is working on Element, ION's based on Bitcoin, Element's based on Ethereum. What we really are here for is to equip people with the tools to be able to do this stuff. Now, from a business perspective, I talk about my personal feelings about why I'm involved in this technology. From a business perspective, having IDs, many IDs, not just one, but a person having many IDs that they can ground truth to through signed attestations from, say, it doesn't have to be a trusted authority like government, but some trusted actor that someone wants to rely on, is something that unlocks a lot of business scenarios, whether it's digitization of notarization, or it's, moving from paper-based scripts to digital scripts in the medical industry, or all these things you see around you that are still sort of ancient and analog processes. We have the opportunity to do with decentralized identifiers and a wider trust fabric what email did to paper mail. And if anyone believes that we won't have digital identity, I would challenge you to go back to sending paper mail, because that's really the equivalent of what we're talking about.
Thanks. It's really an interesting concept, because for those of us who aren't digitally native, and we are sort of helping children maybe learn about protecting themselves on the internet, and then also working with friends and family who have not had the traditional training with respect to how to manage their identities, it's becoming more and more clear to me that there is an absolute need, and there will be an absolute evolution towards more tools for digital identity management. And it sort of brings me to a question for you, Karyl. I saw an interesting post that Transmute was actually founded following a blockchain hackathon. And I saw that in that hackathon, the prompt for you was looking at identity for folks who may be without a state identity. So it could be refugees, for example. But I look into the self-sovereign identity concept overall, and it's not just that people should have access over their own data, but they should have the ability to independently prove they are who say they are. And since this is such a nascent technology, I was wondering if you could share, in your opinion, what types of tools might be required to help people actually take control of their identities and be able to evolve in a state where they can manage them effectively?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's something that I think a lot of companies in the space have run into head on. The education curve is extremely steep. So the technology has evolved at an incredibly fast rate. So I feel like, at least with our internal technology, we're nearly there with regards to powering some of the applications that Daniel was describing. However, if you don't meet the users, whether we're talking about a safety coordinator at a manufacturer who's developing some of these trade documents like what Transmute works on, or you're talking about a person perhaps in a transient position or experiencing something like homelessness, it kind of comes back to design patterns. So we're seeing more and more product folks and designers enter the space. And I think this is probably one of the most critical things to driving adoption, because the data already lives somewhere. So being able to illuminate accessible ways for users to actually access and exercise the new power we're giving back to them is a really complicated problem that we're working really hard to find elegant solutions for. You kind of often hear the example of educating your grandmother on encryption. It's not going to happen. So what kinds of things can we do to prompt them to make decisions about selective disclosure of data or revoking consent? And similarly, the enterprise experiences a lot of the same problems. They want to have sovereign ownership over their data and their trusted relationships as well. And they want the efficiencies of being able to securely share that, but again, not at the expense of accidentally disclosing some of that data. And so we've spent a lot of time working on the definition of the processes that exist today, no matter how manual they are, and understanding how we can leverage, how we can design our front end to prompt the right kinds of action. And so the user actually knows what they're getting into when they are consenting to something with their DID.
That's great, thank you. And maybe just sort of following up and thinking about Transmute and how you've brought use cases to production. You guys have a very interesting use case around provenance of commodities coming into the US. I was wondering if you could just share with us a little bit about that experience and what you've learned when you're dealing with data or assets that may not be digital in nature, but are being represented digitally.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So in particular, the use case that Jason's mentioning is our work with the Department of Homeland Security's SVIP program and Customs Border Protection, where we're working on digitizing some of the point of origin documents involved in the steel trade. So in particular, any product coming into the United States requires proof of origin. And this is generally still one of the most paper-based and non-standard documents that exist today. And so we have a situation where we don't really have an actionable data set about the point of origin of some of these goods. And so what we're working on there is actually being able to uniquely digitize these things in a way that's compatible with existing workflows. So back to that safety coordinator at a manufacturing facility, they feel like they're filling out a digital version of a paper form, but what's actually happening on the back end is that the individual's decentralized or their identity is associated with a decentralized identifier. So is the entities, and now we have the document's identity as well. And so once you've signed documents, digital documents with your DID, you now have the beginning of a much more verifiable data chain. And so that's what we're working on with them. And we think that, especially in times like now where COVID has really completely disrupted the supply and demand, or the predictability of supply and demand, now manufacturers are really starting to care about how to fortify their supply chains against this in the future.
That's great, thank you. It really is interesting. And when you think about that, how the world is changing and the lack of predictability, what you're really looking to do is try to instill more trust and confidence in the data. And I sort of take that and I think about what Moiz is working on with Manitou, and thinking about how these companies can actually provide a higher degree of certainty around that fact that they're protecting customer information and they're giving customers the ability to control more of the information. What I sort of wonder, Moiz, is for your business, is it true that the ledger is not the most interesting aspect of what you have to do, that there's more secret sauce behind it, that the ledger itself can act more as a communication layer?
So look, I think one of the points that Karyl was making, I'd like to just touch on that, which is that how you leverage identity to bind that to data is extremely critical, okay? Because once you do that appropriately, now you know whether that data, you're talking about data attributes of identity itself, or whether you're talking about data artifacts of the types of artifacts that Karyl was referring to. It doesn't really matter. The binding matters. And if you start to bind that appropriately and you provide for automated and built-in encryption services, okay, then my grandmother really doesn't have to think about anything. All she needs to think about is she wants to share a piece of data with Jason. And as long as that binding occurs, only that piece of data is only visible to Jason. Okay, so that's the first point. How, you follow up with that and you look at the types of information sharing that we do. We look at, leveraging blockchain and distributed ledger technologies as what Daniel referred to as notary services, because it's a very, very interesting and strong, powerful notary service. Because when you notarize a transaction of any sort, whether that transaction is data sharing or, actual asset movement, how you notarize that transaction so you can ensure that there are multiple proof points of that particular transaction, extremely interesting. And that's what we concentrate on. How you store that and how you leverage messaging, right? I would suggest there might be other ways of doing that instead of leveraging, some of the more onerous blockchain concepts in that. And that's what we do personally. It doesn't go to say that, you couldn't do it other ways, but we look at it from a transactional, perspective as to how many transactions per second can I provide for. So at London Stock Exchange, we were trying to create systems, billions of transactions per second. I would suggest that when you're trying to do something like that, it becomes very difficult to drive consensus around every single transaction and still provide for that transactional capability. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. We've had lots of conversations about what should you actually put on chain, what should you not. Let's think about the scalability. Let's think about data hubs, where maybe you're hashing the state of an off-chain data hub so that you have the time stamping. Back to your point around a notary service, it absolutely makes sense. And I think for me, one of the biggest realizations that I've had through my journey in understanding digital identity is the fact that it's so much like all of the other blockchain risks. A lot of the risk are really at the on and off ramps and the security in those spots. As long as you're cryptographically hashing the data and it's discoverable by other parties, to your point, in multiple locations, the distributed network, the ability to independently validate a credential associated with an identity is really, really powerful. And that sort of brings me to my next question. And Daniel, sort of going back to you, and then maybe a quick follow-up with Karyl too. You're active in the Decentralized Identity Foundation and the W3C, working on creating standards. I think, Moiz, to your point, you need to have the ability to interoperate on these various solutions, but you want to know that you have the same reference architecture. So Daniel, I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about your work in the DIF, in the W3C, and for really, how do those standards act as catalysts for advancing the ecosystem? And then for those who are not adopting those standards, are they at risk of potentially not achieving user adoption?
Yeah, so I'll say, uniquely, there's been other identity technologies in the past that, while they have had standards, they tend to not be so forced in the way that decentralized identity is. Things with OpenID and OAuth and other things, somewhat, you can call them frameworks almost, because there's lots of room to maneuver in there and sort of not have compatible and federated relationships. And a lot of it's one-off specific setups. With DIDs and the decentralized identity ecosystem, it's very unique in the sense that everyone must universally get on the same page, or else it isn't what it proclaims itself to be. So I would assert that in this specific sphere, that standards are it's everything. If you are non-standard and claim to be wanting to participate in user-first decentralized identity, you're fundamentally not going to be able to. So this one thing I would say to anyone on the line that's from another identity company or something like that, if you're working on things that are, decentralized and identity, and not working with the centralized identity standards in DIF and W3C, you really should, because that product will not get adopted. Like, I can just tell you right now, like Microsoft, huge organization, probably the largest identity organization on the planet in terms of enterprise, we're not going to be going off and pulling off the shelf non-standard things and trying to incorporate that, just because we can't focus on that stuff, right? We have to snap to a standard. So absolutely, I agree. And I would say it's even more dramatic in this particular ecosystem than others.
Yeah, absolutely. And Karyl, maybe just a quick follow-up. I know your organization is also very active in these standards bodies. And I read recently that you're working to support the interoperability working group. which I think is fantastic. I've come from a securities background where you're looking at multiple central securities depositories around the world. How do you make Microsoft or IBM or Apple stock settle in multiple jurisdictions and still be treated the same? So for me, I think it's a great space. I was wondering if you just comment on what's involved there and what are the challenges you're trying to tackle?
Yeah, for sure. First, I want to just echo everything that Daniel said. I completely agree. And in particular, why we've been so involved, as well as with the interoperability group, is that at Transmute, we believe this is core to our business model and core to successful business in the space. So if you imagine for a second, even things like digitizing our driver's licenses, we need a situation where the company that does that for Texas, the Texas version can be used in California. If you think of supply chain, our manufacturers create these origin documents, but there could be 20 to 30 changes of hands before it gets to customs. So how do we make sure that without painting myself in a corner from a sales perspective and having to go the consortia route, how do I make sure that I'm adding value to customers throughout the ecosystem? So I think interoperability is key to decentralized identity-based business models. And then in particular, the interop group at DIF, I know is working to map the ecosystem and basically direct support, technical support towards the gaps in the standards that are supporting interoperability. And I think the perspective I just shared is becoming a pretty common one in the broader community when it comes to interop.
Great, thank you. And I'm cognizant of time, so Moiz, maybe one more question for you is, when we're thinking about how corporations today have federated identity models and they're looking at agreements across internal service providers, how could companies that you support actually streamline or simplify the way that they're handling identity and credentials by adopting these credentials? Do they need to do it on the outside, or can it be done as a service?
Well, we certainly support that service model because look, how authentication occurs, we can go down that path. I agree that having a particular spec that defines what identity and how you authenticate identities and what mechanisms exist, that spec should be followed. It only makes things easier and stronger to support. But at the end of the day, how you onboard that identity and how you provide identity proofing, right? These are mechanisms. I don't know if we can go into every single one of our clients and state that they need to really change the mechanism that they have that already exists. So federating to existing models while providing stronger capabilities is something that we're really trying to concentrate on.
That's great. I know our time. There's so many more questions I had for you guys. I wanted to maybe dive into zero knowledge verification, things like that. It's just a really deep space. So I just want to pause and thank you all once again for sharing your perspectives and helping us bring more information to the community. And certainly folks can follow up with you guys if they have specific questions afterwards. But once again, thank you so much for being part of our privacy conference. And Rhea, back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for that great conversation on decentralized identity.